To know. Hi everyone, thanks for sticking around to the last paper session. This is work that I did jointly with three of my PhD students, E.T. Garcia, Alex Shervani, Rachel Farrell. Alex is here, I believe. There he is, in the back. All of us are now at the University of Kentucky, except for E.T. Garcia, who is still at the University of New Orleans. Okay, so this is a paper about experience management. In what setting are we doing this work? Well, we are creating an interactive narrative where the player controls one of the characters, and the experience manager, the thing we're working on, controls all the non-player characters to jointly tell a story that meets some author-defined constraints. And so this definition does not include all interactive narratives, but it includes sort of a big enough group that we are happy.
Really more of a comment. That should say Riddell and Stern. It's a...
Oh, yeah. Very sorry about that. I have my my Mendeley database is wrong.
Review number 2, Mike.
Ooh. Yeah.
We go way back, I can tease, right?
Yeah, no, it's fine. This is actually not the first time this has happened in a live presentation with Mark. So okay. And by that I mean not the first time that I've gotten the citation wrong. Citation wrong. Okay, where was I? Okay, so we've got three sorts of things that can happen in these stories. We've got player actions where the player is the only one who has to choose to do it. We've got non-player character actions where the non-player character is the only one who has to choose to do it. And we've got joint actions where both the player and the non-player character have to have some reason to do it. So the abstraction, the way that we're representing our story is a story graph, and the words story graph and plot graph and other things, have been used sort of inconsistently throughout the literature. So what do we mean by a story graph? Well, we mean it's a state-space graph, so it's a graph where the nodes are states, and there are three kinds of edges, which are either player actions, joint actions, or NPC actions. So we've got a story graph, and so a path through this graph is a story. And some of these stories are good, meaning that they meet our author constraints, and some of them are bad. Okay, so there are many high-level approaches to how do you tell a good interactive story that meets these constraints. One of them, many story-based systems, what they do is they form a plan for what they want the non-player characters to do, and either what they expect the player to do or maybe what they hope the player is going to do. But if you've ever designed an interactive narrative, you know that players never do what you hope the players are going to do, or even what you expect them to do. So what do we do in that situation? Well, one option is we can intervene, which means the player tried to take an action that was going to screw up our beautiful story, so we just don't let it happen. The more ideal situation is we would accommodate, which is we actually just reorganize our story to allow the player to do that action. Hey, we can still tell a good story. The danger with accommodating, though, is all you're doing is checking to make sure that a good story can exist. So what if later down the line the player does more unexpected things, and that ends up putting you in a story that somehow does not meet your constraints? Basically, the problem is one of this, a system which every time it tries to accommodate, makes sure that a new good story exists, says, well, for all player actions there exists a good story, but that's not good enough. What we would really like is to say, for all player actions, all possible stories are going to meet our author constraints. So that's what this paper was about. So what we're trying to do here is proactive mediation, which is the decisions we get to make, which are the joint and non-player character action decisions, or ones we get to contribute to. We want to make sure that we only take action such that no matter what the player does, we're still going to end up in a story that meets our constraints. Okay, so our goal is an interactive narrative where the author's goal is always achieved with no intervention. In every state, the player is always allowed to take any action which is possible. In other words, we're always trying to accommodate and never intervene. Okay, so how do we know the long-term implications of the choice on a space of possible stories? This is what makes this such a challenging problem. When someone makes an action, what consequences is that going to have 5 or 6 or 7 actions down the line? And we sort of punted on this question. We said, okay, you know what we're going to do? We're going to find a story domain where the entire story graph can fit in memory. That way, every time we make a decision, we know the long-term consequences on the space of possible stories we can tell. For this, we're using the Camelot interactive narrative environment. So thank you very much, Alex, for being the mastermind behind the Camelot environment. For those who haven't seen yet, this is an interactive environment that allows you to put a nice, an easy, like 3D rendered experience on top of an experience manager. So we have a very simple domain. The player starts at home. There is also a market. There is a camp. And there is a crossroads that connects this is actually like a little microcosm from an earlier game called The Best Laid Plans. So the player starts off at home. There is a merchant in the market. There's also a guard in the market. And there's a bandit in the camp. The player starts with some money. The merchant has medicine, and your goal is to get the medicine. The merchant is also selling a sword. The guard has a sword. The bandit has a sword. And there's also some money sitting in the bandit's camp, like in a chest. So what can you do? You can walk around, you can buy stuff, you can sell stuff, you can rob people, you can attack people, you can take the money out of the chest, and you can tell the guard where the bandit is. So if you know where the bandit is, you can go up to the guard and say, hey, I've seen the bandit, and the guard will do whatever the guard's going to do, including going after the bandit. There's two possible endings. Either the player is going to return home with the medicine, or they're going to die trying. Very, very simple set of author, and this is what we mean by our author constraints. We want to make sure that every story ends with one of these two endings. How big is that story graph? Well, we needed about 2 terabytes of RAM to generate that story graph. It seems like a really simple domain, right? Well, it takes up 2 terabytes of RAM. And here I'd like to acknowledge the Louisiana Optical Networking Initiative for giving us access to a supercomputer with that much RAM. Okay, so here's our basic method. We're going to start with the full story graph. Every possible state that could ever happen, every possible action that could ever happen. We're going to remove only non-player character and joint edges, so only the edges that we as the experience manager are allowed to choose to do or not. Until every node has all possible edges for the player, so the player can always do anything that is where the preconditions are satisfied, any action the player would expect to do in that moment. And we have 0 or 1 edges for non-player characters, so the non-player characters always know what they have to do. All the decisions have been made in advance. When the game is actually running, all the AI is doing is walking through the graph. Okay, so we did 8 kinds of pruning on this graph to get it down to what was the final story graph, and I'm just going to talk briefly about some of these. Obviously the details are in the paper, so I'm going to sort of take this chance to highlight some of the weird, interesting bugs that we found and why we did things this way and why we did it in this order. So the first thing, this is where like most of the real intelligence comes into our system, is we want to make sure that every agent who acts believes that that action is going to causally contribute to one of their goals. Otherwise, we're going to prune that action. So there's not a lot of time to go into this. This is a lot of our previous work on planning. But basically, there are actions that can actually happen. There are actions that characters think can happen. There are actions that contribute to a player's goal, and we're saying that believable actions are the ones in this space, the ones that characters think are possible and that they think are going to help them achieve their goals, even if it turns out they really aren't. So basically, we apply a lot of our previous work on narrative planning, and we identify any edges that don't meet this definition, and we prune them. So after this pruning, our graph has about 388 million nodes and over 1 billion edges. These numbers are actually artificially small, because to do that belief reasoning, we have to reason about lots and lots of states that are actually impossible, but that characters believe are possible. So these numbers only reflect actual states that are really possible. The real graph we're working with is actually much larger. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is shorter plan pruning. So anytime an agent has 2 ways to achieve the same goal, we prune the longer plan. Why are we doing this so early? That's going to come up in a minute. Okay, so the next one, this was sort of the most controversial part of our system. This is the thing a lot of people were curious about or sort of disagreed with. This is a principle we're calling lazy NPC pruning. So when both a non-player character and the player have a way to achieve the same goal, we're going to wait for the player to do it instead of having the non-player character do it. Now, why did we do that? It's because we ran into weird situations like this. So the player, or the merchant wants to make money, the player wants the medicine, so obviously we've got like a natural pairing here. The player's going to go buy the medicine, right? When you don't do this, you get stuff like this. The merchant leaves the market and comes to you. It's like, oh, this is like not so bad, right? We've got these active NPCs. This is really great. Well, let's say you don't buy the medicine. Let's say you go to the crossroads. The merchant follows you. Then you go to the market. The merchant follows you. Basically, anywhere you go, the merchant's going to follow you around, constantly hoping. The merchant can't sell it to you without your consent. So the merchant, basically what you end up with in this situation is a posse of NPCs following you around, constantly hoping for one particular interaction. So this is why we are adopting this sort of lazy NPC principle. We're going to let the player come to them. All right, so when both the player and a non-player character could act to achieve the same goal, we prove the NPC action, and this is how our graph goes down. This takes quite a lot of volume out of our graph. The next one we're going to do is unique endings pruning. So anytime there are actions and they reduce the number of endings that are available, we want to least reduce the number of endings that are available. So the sort of design goal behind this is we want the player, not the experience manager, to be responsible for the ending that you get. So it's kind of a notable moment of agency when the player does something that reduces the available endings. That's good. We as the experience manager don't want to be defining what ending you're going to get. So here's another one of the little subtle things in our system. Why do we do shorter plan pruning so early? Specifically, why do we do it before unique endings pruning? Seems like maybe shorter plan is so simple. Why don't we do that at the end? Because of weird situations like this. So let's say you, the player, are in the market and you decide you're going to be a lawbreaker and you kill the merchant so you can take the medicine. Well, one thing the guard can do is the guard can just attack you and kill you. Like that seems like a reasonable thing the guard could do. Another thing the guard could do, this plan will technically work, is the guard could pick up the merchant's sword and use that to attack you. And you look at that and say, okay, this is like a clear situation where you've got two plans. One of them is unnecessarily long. Well, that kept happening. Players kept taking these weirdly unnecessarily long sequences of actions to achieve their goal. And the reason we eventually figured out was because of the combinations of these two things. The guard picking up the merchant's sword does not reduce the number of endings that are available to the player. It's only when the guard attacks you that it reduces the number of endings to the player. So we were basically unintentionally biasing our characters towards these really unnecessarily long plans because they were cutting off the number of endings that were available. By the way, also the reason we're doing intentionality pruning first is to make sure that this does eventually happen. So the guard will eventually attack you. Even though it reduces the number of endings, it's more important for characters to continue to be intentional than it is for them, for example, the bandit to just follow you around and never steal from you. So it's only when we have a choice of actions that we're doing that. All right, so the next one is goal priority pruning. When non-player characters have multiple plans they could be pursuing, how do we know which one we're going to do? Basically, they're always going to do their higher priority goals. Here's the reason why. The guard has two goals. The guard wants to punish criminals, and the guard wants to be at his post in the market. So when you see the bandit, you can go to the market and say, hey, guard, I saw the bandit. And the guard will say, okay, great, I'm going to go chase him. Goes to the crossroad. Then the guard says, wait, I'm not at my post. Wait, I've got to go get the bandit. Wait, I'm not at my post. And we end up with these weird sort of cyclic situations where characters are waffling back and forth between two goals and doing weird, like, repeated behavior. So we sort of applied a hack here which says goals have priority and you're always going to do the highest priority one first. The reason this is a dirty hack is because storytelling is non-Markovian. A lot of our previous work has sort of demonstrated the fact that it's not just about the state you're in, it's about how you got there. Our system, which is dealing with this giant graph, cannot keep track of your history. That would make this problem way, way, way harder. So this was kind of a dirty hack that we used to sort of, account for the non-Markovian nature of storytelling. So when we do this, it cuts our graph down a little bit more. All right, then cycle pruning. This does not get rid of all cycles. When we have cycles, we detect them and break them. Finally, if we have many actions left for an NPC, we say they're all equally good. We pick one at random. And then the final one is dead-end pruning. We want to make sure that there are no states that you can get into where the game cannot end. And there were not very many. We only had to remove about 10 nodes and 12 edges from this giant graph to make sure that there weren't any dead ends left. But the fact that they still exist is proof that this storytelling, the long-term implications of a decision is a hard problem. Okay, so those are the different pruning techniques that we did. We did an evaluation here, which was a very simple setup. We compared the story graph that we made versus a control story graph. We went through a lot of different versions and a pilot study to determine what our control was going to be. In the end, we decided it's going to be a random story graph. That seems weird. There's lots of options for control. Why do we use random? Basically, the thing we are trying to control for is the built-in quality of this story domain. What are your chances of accidentally telling a good story in this domain? That's what we're trying to control for. So basically, we used a random story graph. Technically, it's not quite random because it turns out in a random story graph, there's a very high chance that some NPC just randomly kills you and you can't ever get to the ending where you complete the goal. So we did a little bit of a hack to make sure there's always at least one way that you can get the other ending. but it is basically a random story graph. Because of our pilot study where we found a huge ordering effect, basically people always liked the second one better in our pilot study, no matter what it was. So you actually explore the world first, then you play either the control or the experimental version in random order. So our evaluation, we basically asked 4 questions, and we had very encouraging results. So players agreed that our characters felt realistic. They agreed that characters reacted to things they saw and ignored things they did not see. We did not achieve statistical significance here, but you can tell based on the effect size that people preferred our version about 2 to 1, and with a larger sample size, we would have eventually achieved significance here, we believe. So characters tried to accomplish their goals. And also, my actions had a significant effect on the story. So we, in this case, people are showing a pretty strong preference for our story graph. Okay, so what can we take away from this? One, story graphs get real big, real fast. Also, random story graphs are a surprisingly good baseline. So it's not that people disliked the random one and liked ours. They liked both story graphs a lot. They just liked ours more. So we had, just anecdotally, we had people jump through incredible mental hoops to explain the random behavior that they saw. Things like, oh, the first time I went to the market, the guard and the merchant were just standing there, but then I left and I came back and suddenly they were fighting, and I just assumed like maybe they were lovers and like they had a fight off screen while I was out there, and then when I came back they were fighting. It's like, no, it was just random behavior. But it sort of just goes to show like how we really want to narrativize everything we see, and so that's what that means is controlling for that is surprisingly hard, and random story graphs do a surprisingly good job of controlling for that. And also we need non-Markovian experience management. We're making a lot of simplifying assumptions in this domain. There are so many ways that we could make this problem more interesting and more intelligent. Also, we have an evaluated artifact, hooray. We have released the story graphs. Both the original story graph and the final story graph that have been compiled down into only 80 gigabytes instead of 2 terabytes. It has a lot of really great intentional information, including in every state, like what each character is like planning to do. So if you're interested in working with things like intentionality and belief, and you don't want to implement all the complicated algorithms we used for doing this, you can go download these graphs, and all that information is really like easily accessible for you. So I hope other people will have fun with these graphs. That's it. I just thank you for the NSF for supporting this work. Also, I just got another NSF grant to do intelligent storytelling in virtual reality, and I'm looking for PhD students. So if you are a undergrad or master's student looking to do a PhD, or if you have such students, please send them my way. Thanks.
Probably one question.
Oh, it's me, Paul.
So could you talk a little bit about the evaluation part where like these respondents chose a Likert scale kind of question, a preference question?
Yeah, so there's more detail in the paper. Okay. It was Likert scale questions. We attempted to do a between subjects analysis as well. Okay. It was not sufficiently, 2 groups of 10 is not sufficiently powered to draw any interesting conclusions, so the only results we're presenting are the between subjects, or the within subjects.
Was the stimuli randomized and counterbalanced?
Yes.
Okay, but you still saw a learning effect?
In the pilot study.
Okay.
In the first study we did, people always liked the second version better. So we added a situation where they get you. We think it's because, oh, they were exploring the environment, it was so cool, and then they were paying attention to the story in the second version. So basically we had them explore. They got all the shiny environment out of their system before playing either version.
Thank you.
I think that's it.
All right. Thank you.